All right, welcome everyone to another edition of the forecast contest. I'm going to start off as always looking at most recent verification, starting March 24th, 28th. So we had only 60.9 HDDs for this period, which I believe the closest was Joshua Herman at 76.5. So no one was what I would say particularly close this week. Looking at the scores, looks like Matt Lanza and Dr. Decker did pretty well. Nat Johnson did well. CFS did not do well. So I'll just jump straight into the temperature departures. Looks like the entire East Coast was quite warm. Uh, won't hear any complaints from me on that. With some warmth in other higher demand areas, with pretty large slug of cooler temps in the southwest, so probably not helping with the HDD production over there. Let's see how the models did. That doesn't look particularly good to me. Feel free to chime in if you have any thoughts on the euro there. And the CFS also looks really bad. So not looking too good on the temperature forecast from the models, although the Euro did a little bit better than the CFS just because it had more warmth. Um, I guess I'll give it some credit. It did do well with the warmth in the north central area. Looks pretty almost spot on with that, but really both models seem to have just completely whiffed on the East Coast warmth uh, and on the cool air section in the southwest. We'll take a look also at the 500s. See a nice big ridge off the east coast. Again, not complaining about that. Wish it would stay there for a while, but um, let's see if either of the models were able to pick that up. CFS has the polar opposite. That's a nice big trough over the east. And the euro looks like it kind of forgot to forecast for a huge chunk of the Atlantic and part of Europe. um, Nice big ridge in the middle of the country, so I'll give it a little credit for that. But overall, I'd say this was a pretty bad forecast for both the models for this period. Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I guess one thought. I mean, aren't there levels of bad? I mean, that CFS map was. I mean, that was really bad, right? Or did I miss that?
Which one, the temperature or the
Yeah,
500?
yeah. It's just I thought you kind of compared like, well, EC and CFS, but I mean, the CFS. This was. I mean, what was the verification again?
Verification was 60, and it was almost double or I guess half what the CFS had.
See, I know it has to be really bad because it was worse than me. And so no, but like that one, any thoughts in terms of what? Because I know we've been saying, and Dr. Decker, who's on the line, was the first to bring this up this winter about the CFS doing a little bit better this winter. But and then I think someone maybe it was even last week or the week before started to bring up, well, we'll see how it does in the summer because if it has a cool bias, it could be it could it might be accentuated, right, as you get to the summer for reasons we discussed before the line about maybe summer trends and things like that. I just I'm speculating a lot here, and I'm putting a lot of like little pieces together. But could it be that the CFS is starting to we're starting to see some of the older the kind of performance we normally expect. But I guess the real question is if you can shed a little bit more light on just like do you have any thoughts in terms of why it missed so poorly this period?
Well, from a simple point, I mean, I don't know. I'll just give my initial 2 cents. would be that it performed so poorly because it just didn't. The 500 millibar map is just completely wrong.
Yeah.
It missed the ridge in the Gulf of Alaska. It missed the ridge off the East Coast. It has a trough where there's supposed to be a ridge off the East Coast. So I think well, there's something changed this period that um, made it just its 500 millibar maps miss completely, and as a result of that, its temperature map also missed completely. Because I could see that if this 500 millibar pattern um, verified, that this temperature might make sense. Cold with the trough, and ridge over the west coast, maybe with frothy in the east makes sense with cooler in the east with maybe some warmth in the west. That would make sense, but looking at the actual 500, it just like completely just this is one of the worst forecasts I can remember it having from a 500 millibar perspective this winter. Now, granted, I don't remember all of them, but um, you know, so that would be my guess as to what went wrong with this forecast. I don't know what caused it to go so wrong at the 500 millibar level. Maybe I'll just take a look at the
Hey,
MJO.
Michael, while you're doing that, I just want to give you, I mean, I think what you're doing is a really good process, though, because what you're saying is sometimes we do see those errors where, we look at the upper levels and we say, hey, the EC and CFS look about the same, but at the surface, the CFS is just far too cold because of surface issues, right? The problems it has in terms of predicting surface temperature. But you're right. This is a case. The point you're trying to make is that's not the issue here, or that's not the only issue. It actually got the jet stream pattern wrong, and so now I like where you're going with that, because that's an important distinction. And then the question is, why did it get the jet stream pattern so wrong? Which is, I think, where you're taking us right now.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Okay, apparently.
The
Um,
U.S.
Can I jump in
government
on this?
sites are all down right now.
oh,
So like a good chunk of them are.
that is unfortunate. Let's see. Maybe I can find it on here. Um, Models page, maybe. Dave, do you know where they have the MJO on this site, or do they not have it on this site?
I don't know. I don't look at the MJ on this side. I usually just go to CPC's cover. But I hear where you're going. You can try the Aussie if you want just the
Yeah.
verification. Aussie, yeah, just do Aussie. Yeah. There you go.
Let's see. Make this any bigger? Just make that a little bigger. Why is it going left? All right. Well, looks like it's in. If am I reading this correctly? Start there. So it ends. So right now it looks like it's in phase 4, which let's go back to 90 days. I mean, I guess it's never been in phase 4 these past couple of months. Maybe that has something to do with it. I'm kind of doubtful of that, but
Hey, Dave, can I jump in on this
yeah,
for
sure.
Michael?
Go for it.
So, Michael, I think you're in the right direction here by kind of poking around at what kind of caused the long range forecast to kind of go awry, and kind of suspecting that, obviously the jet stream pattern looked a lot different. And we always like to think, if we can roll the clock back, we like to think about it in terms of like forcings. What was a forcing that made that jet stream look like that? And I think you're in the right area here by thinking about it from a tropical forcing perspective. Sometimes what's helpful is to maybe roll back the clock. And I'm not saying we have to do this now, but roll back the clock to what were we thinking in the day or two leading up to when we made this forecast. And I'll share with you when we made this forecast, which I think was the 9th of March. Is that what right? Would have been the 9th.
Yeah.
Yeah, what we were seeing was, go back to your MJO plot for a minute, Michael. And this is obviously, I don't really love looking at like the Wheeler-Hendon plot because I think it's a bit of a misrepresentation of maybe where the best tropical forcing is. But nevertheless, those, the end of that first week of March, the MJO was it was actually split between a piece over South America and then some forcing emerging, kind of maybe more over Indonesia and then a little bit over Africa. So the Wheeler-Hendon was a little bit misrepresentative of being like around phase 8-1, but it was really pretty weak, the aggregate forcing. If I look back just a minute ago, I looked back on my screen of what the prediction was, and it looked like the forecasts were for it to kind of go into more of the circle of death, and not really show a lot of coherency. What instead happened was, over the last, say, 7 or 8 days, conjunction with this forecast period we were verifying, we saw like a reconsolidation of the forcing over Indonesia. And you're seeing a reflection of that by this Wheeler-Hendon piece going into phases 3 and 4. So it took on a much more La Nina-ish base state. I'm not saying we could have foreseen that. I think, a lot of the forecasts were kind of leaning in the right direction towards where verification ended up. But that you're poking around the right area is what I wanted to say. I think you just kind of have to continue with that line of thinking, to like the extension of like, what were we thinking on when we made the forecast window? What were we thinking like on that day? Sometimes I go back and like refer to my notes that I took about what I was seeing and what I was commenting on, and then asking yourself kind of like, did that verify? And if it didn't, what happened? But you're in the right track is kind of what I wanted to say.
Okay. I have a question actually. So I've noticed that the MJO this year has had a lot of split signals, and I haven't been, looking at the MJO all that long. Is that something that happens often? Because I don't recall that being a thing the past, I guess, year or two, except for this one, or happening that often.
You're right when it's compared to like the last couple of winters, like the winter of 1920, didn't see as much of this kind of bifurcation of the MJO across the tropics. This year saw, kind of multiple, I think of it, you could think of it as a split or really more of just maybe a bit of a confused look where the core of convection is in the tropics. And this year, while we had a La Nina base state, that wasn't a perfect, it was good for a lot of the winter, but it wasn't good for, critical parts of winter for both Western Europe and North America, obviously. And so some of that may have been reflected by the MJO being a little, I guess, hiccupy or not really quite as static as what we've been used to seeing. But you're right, compared to at least the last 2 winters.
Hey, Michael, I want to jump in on that too, because I think that's a really good point. And actually, a couple of things there. I think also Dave's earlier point about how this MJO back then wasn't performing or wasn't behaving maybe like a canonical type MJO. I remember that actually too, because I actually do some forecasting for Australia. I also did Outback, and what I saw was that, like we were in Australia, they were getting, some of their best rains a couple of weeks ago, like when it was in phase 8-1, which is pretty unusual, right? Like you would expect the rains when the MJO is over the maritime continent. So I just thought that was a really good point that they brought up in terms of the fact that, the MJO wasn't behaving like a canonical MJO. And so maybe we shouldn't have expected necessarily a canonical response 15 days later. So that was just one thing. Two, sort of what Dave also gets into is, these areas of research in the MJO. What you asked is a difficult question too, in terms of, when is it behaving like it's expected almost, and what is expected? But I think some of the ways you can get into that are charts beyond this. Like Carl Schreck has some good charts you might want to look up sometime, where you look at these RMM components, and that, this RMM is created from like components of wind at different levels, 850, 200, and OLR. So there's components that actually make up this chart. And I think even taking it one step further, and then there's, of course, there's different time scales to look at, or wavelengths, Kelvin waves are smaller, El Nino is bigger, MJO is in the middle. And ultimately, it's how do all these things, these waves and things like that, influence the extratropical pattern, and vice versa a little bit. So in other words, ultimately, when you're saying like, what kind of tropical response is most likely to give me a big ridge trough or a trough ridge? I think those are, and actually Nat Johnson's on the line too. I think he jumped on, who's done some work on these. But I think those are still like, I think those are still, there's still more like, even like, I think work to be done there in terms of better understanding exactly what those triggers are. Or understanding them in even better detail than today, which is, again, we can look at some of our composites that we've created, some even through our forecast contests, some through the CPC has some great composites where you can say, hey, phase 5, 15 days later, whatever, trough ridge, phase 1, 15 days later, ridge trough. But I think what you're saying is, can we go even deeper beyond that to understand when it may be more or less likely, when there's more constructive interference, deconstructive interference, things like that. Those are some really good questions. I don't have great answers, but I think they're good questions.
So this is more of like a question/statement kind of thing. So I assume then, for looking at the MJO overall, using this is better than using this one, because you can actually see where the waves are propagating, and you can if there's some type of conflicting signal, um, then you have a better chance of making a forecast, and instead of it looking like, oh, it's in the null phase, it doesn't help me. It's actually like, you can see something on here that tells you, well, maybe not uh, in the null phase, right?
I'm sorry, was that a question for me?
Well, anyone that wants to answer, it's just,
Wait, I'm sorry, I got lost. Say that one more time.
Basically, I was saying it's better to use this, especially in situations where there's like conflicting signals, because this will just show you that it's in the null phase if their signals are conflicting.
Oh, I see.
And this one, you might see something that tells a little bit of a different story.
Yeah. I mean, yes, but like, so this is showing the OLR. Is that what you clicked on, or is this velocity?
Yeah, I think this is the OLR. It looks
OLR,
similar.
or
Well, this is OLR, but
where'd you click? The OLR time longitude? Is that where you were?
it just
Oh,
it just says
okay.
CPC on MJO indices.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure, but it
Great
looks.
labels on that. But
Yeah.
I mean, the point is, right, I think it's OR, and I guess the point I was trying to make, I think you're right in this, but in the sense that, right, if you just look at the Wheeler-Hendon, it's a combination, right? And it's an index, right? So it's like taking, points, right? It's EOFs, like two leading EOFs. But it's a blend of OR, 850 winds and 200 winds, to my knowledge. So you're right, like there could be a situation where effectively the OLR component is, I don't know, in phase 5, but the 200 millibar wind is in phase 1. So really, in order to really decipher all of that, you want to be able to look at all 3 components. You want to look at a time longitude of all 3, or like I mentioned, you don't have to do this now, but I know someone like Carl Schreck, or he used to have like a really good site where he would break the Wheeler-Hendon MJO into its 3 components. So you could look at the 200 wind only. You could look at the 850 wind only. He even had some stuff where you could look, I think, at different wavelengths, like not just MJO, but like maybe like the ENSO component and stuff like that. But I think, those could be helpful, but you got to also be careful too, because if you haven't done the research on that, then you don't know how helpful it is. In other words, 200 is in phase 5, but 850 isn't. So, well, I mean, I mean, does that mean you're expecting less of a response than the historical composites that are just based on Wheeler-Hendon? So you have to do the research. Ultimately, I think it's interesting to see, though, like one of the questions I would like to ask or answered, and I think this gets toward sort of what Dave was saying is, uh, presumably, if there's, I think the hypothesis is if there's interference, you're going to expect less of a uh, not as amplified of a response. So in other words, if normally in phase 5 you would expect a 60% chance for it to be warm 15 days later, that maybe if one of the components was in phase 5 but one of the components wasn't, that it would be less than 60%. But then again, if all three components, OLR, 850, 200, were all lined up with good amplitude in phase 5, that maybe you would expect a 90% confidence. And I think that's where it gets interesting and potentially helpful in terms of providing better visibility into the potential for an event.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. All right. I'm gonna look at one last thing before I move on to the current forecast. Is it this one? Yes. Want to get into a habit of looking at the verifications to see. So it looks like for the past month, uh, it's not the best of labeling, but it looks like the GFS ensembles have been doing the best in the 11 to 15 day period. I want to say that's going to be the Euro. I'm not entirely sure, but it looks like the GFS has been doing particularly well this last month, which kind of lines up with how the CFS has been doing up until I think this past forecast, at least a 500. And
If I could jump in, it looks like if I'm reading, oh, well, is this, I guess the x-axis on these plots is the verification date, not the forecast date. I was thinking there was that big drop off, right? When this particular forecast, from 3 weeks ago was made. But if that's not the forecast date, but if that's the verification date, then that's irrelevant. But I guess there's another drop off at the end. So
yeah, it
where
doesn't.
we are.
Yeah,
So yeah, you do see it's, I guess, consistent with, the CFS is falling off of this, that there was something a little bit more unpredictable with the situation 2-3 weeks ago.
yeah. I mean, look at just looking at this from Friday's verification, the GFS and the EC were both negative. So they were so wrong that they doing the opposite would have been better for that period. So certainly let's look at temperature. Yeah, even temperature was it's a little bit different time, but even the temperature was pretty bad in that general period. So something went wrong in that area, and not quite sure what, but looks like the early March to and later in March didn't do too particularly well. All right. So unless anyone has anything else they want to add, I'm gonna move to the current forecast.
Yeah, I was just going to say, keep in mind that that's the 11 to 15, right? So presumably the 16 to 20 is even worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, oh, today is not 4/6. I don't know why I clicked on 4/6. I'm ready for April. All right. So just take a quick look. Once again, the CFS and well, I guess Josh Herman's our coldest forecaster, but CFS and EC seem to be in agreement as to it being around the 30-year normal. Um, rolling around, we have Dr. Decker on the low end, with followed very closely by a lot of big names. So it looks like it might end up being a little bit warmer than the models. Let's see. I didn't submit the forecast, but unless somebody has a desire to go first, I'll run through my forecast. All right, let me just do.
I guess while you're loading your stuff up, because mine's pretty simple, I'm just looking at the CPC and it was another warm forecast. A little less probability further north where more of the HDDs would be this time of year, but still it's red or orange. So I did go on the low ends in terms of the HDDs based on that map. And they seemed fairly confident in their discussion. Interestingly, they seem to focus a lot on their dynamical tools. So it's kind of interesting that although they make their forecast, I think, on Fridays. So seeing that the CFS and ECMWF are not as warm, at least right now, is kind of interesting. But you can see there, yeah, their outlook is primarily based on dynamical model forecasts. So maybe there's been a change from Friday to Tuesday in those dynamical forecasts. But I just go off of this discussion and this map for my forecasts.
Yeah, why don't I can take a look. I think is it 4-panel? I don't know. We'll see what happens. Let's see. I don't know if I can. Let's do 500 height departure. Yeah. Oh, is this how that works? All right, well, I'll come back to that when I figure out how to use it. Where's the, oh, here we go. Okay, and then let's just do. Okay, so for my forecast, I started off my usual way, blending together the 10-year and the Euro forecast, which got me to a starting point of 57.13 HDDs. And then I usually take a look if it will work. Wrong button, teleconnections. Okay. Taking a look at the teleconnections, looks like the NAO might want to go negative. It has been verifying a little bit more on the positive side recently, so I'm a little hesitant there to go too gung-ho with, you know, the cold with that. The AO also doesn't look particularly like it wants to go negative. Again, it's been verifying at the very upper edge of guidance, even going above guidance this past few weeks. And the PNA looks like it wants to head back towards positive with the forecast, but again, it's actually been verifying below guidance recently, and before that, it was kind of at the upper end. So this is not exactly a clear signal from this, but I would lower my my HDDs by 1 or 2 based on it probably being warmer. Not seeing a very clear cold signal from any of these teleconnections here. And then, of course, the CPC, as Dr. Decker already mentioned, looking very warm, hoping that is in fact correct for New Jersey. Um, so probably would be around the 52 range. If I had to give an exact number, probably like 52.5 would probably be around where I would be with my forecast map looking like warmth through the eastern 2/3 of the country with probably normal temperatures along the west coast with some expectation of warm southwest, cooler northwest configuration in that area, kind of balancing each other out. Any questions, comments, complaints, concerns?
Can we see that AO forecast again you had up? The 11:15. I just want to see how bad that was again.
Yeah, it's been essentially a roller coaster this past month.
It's not too helpful, is it?
Up and down. For what it's worth, it looks like it's stabilized at the upper end of guidance.
Yeah, I guess since March 16th anyway, around that time.
Yeah, this, to be honest with you, having used this regularly for the past, I guess, year and a half now. I actually prefer it if it's stable, you know, really on the upper end of guidance or on the lower end of guidance or even, wherever it is. But when it's stable, it's easier to kind of predict where its forecast is gonna end up going wrong. Because, what do you do with this? Like, if it's at the upper end and at the lower end in like a week period, like I have no idea what I would like do with that. Is it gonna go up again? Is it gonna stay at the bottom? Is it gonna go up and go right back down in the same forecast period? I just wouldn't know. But if it's stable like it is here or like it kind of was here, yeah, I'd even say that the for most of winter it was reasonably stable. You know, um, this I can work with. This is I don't know what to do with that. And let's see if the MAO is any better. The MAO has been pretty stable this year, which is a bit odd, but
That's, I mean, that's a, it's, I mean, that, I hear what you're saying, but it is like, it is an interesting point. What maybe other folks have some thoughts on it, like, what do you do with that? And that actually reminded me of one other thing. And it was something that Dave Darkangelo said earlier. It was something he said that triggered this thought. When we were talking about the verification for this current forecast. And I was thinking to myself, when Dave started to talk, like, I thought he was even going to say this, like, about the fact that if I remember correctly, the next 5 days, actually, the HDDs are going to be normal. Some of the forecasts even show above normal. And so my point is that timing was also, it gets, I think it's harder to make these 16 to 20-day forecasts, right? Or at least harder with skill above climatology when there's a lot of variability to the pattern, right? When it's warm 1 5-day period, then it's cool another 5-day period, and then bounces back warm. And because if you're off by just a couple days on your timing, even if you had the pattern right, you could be really off, right? In terms of HDDs, and that's another issue. And I know we've talked about it a little bit, but like, how do you, part of it is a communication thing, a big part. Like, how do you communicate the fact that you're expecting a variable pattern where you're going to go bounce from plus 10 to minus 10 HDDs and back and forth and stuff.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
thanks for the pub there. But the sometimes we view this as like a sentiment issue, or we discuss it as kind of a base state, meaning that like these 5-day windows are really, really challenging to nail. But sometimes we'll refer to it as like kind of what's the base state telling us? Is it like a warm dominated base state? Is it a cold dominated base state? Is it just a choppy path? Sometimes we can refer to that as sentiment. Like, what's the sentiment of the of the forecast, right? Like, because the good example would be on a very long time series, like the winter of 2020, 2021. Despite like one of the coldest 20-day periods on record in the middle of the country, the sentiment was overwhelmingly warm. And if you just ignore that stretch, the winter pretty much worked out like the preseason sentiment would have guessed. Now, misplaced kind of where the aboves were strongest, et cetera, but overall it was kind of a correct base state was to assume more. That's not to say you shouldn't be shooting for getting those smaller periods correct, and we're in a very small window with like 5 days. But yes, we refer to it as kind of like a base state or a path dependency. It is a big thing on communication, right? It's hard to quantify objectively.
Thank you.
So along those lines, I mean, couldn't you go back to the say 11 to 15 AO forecast or AO index? I mean, it seems like it's not doing so bad with the lower frequency, like during the period when it was, persistently negative. The forecast was generally in there, and then when positive, its forecast is generally positive. So, so maybe it had the sentiment with, but there's a lot of uncertainty on these shorter time scales. So from a probabilistic perspective, there there seems like there's some skill at that longer range.
By the way, now I think that's a really good point. This actually came up, I think, last week or a couple weeks ago. The fact that, you know, when you look at the correlation there, and Michael, maybe you could scroll a little bit more down because it's almost, yeah, thank you. The correlation looks pretty decent, right? But I think like what Nat said, a lot of that's based on that December 1st through, you know, May 10th period, where it was generally forecast to be negative, it verified negative, and, you know, like now the variability seemed less. So, but since February 15th, right, seems like something's changed, right? And it seems like it has had a more difficult time maybe in the variability, and like I think that, yeah, like Nat was saying, maybe there's more synoptic variability. Maybe, you know, I think that's when the stratosphere maybe became more involved. So maybe the pattern just became more complex, and maybe it became more complex in certain areas where the model does not resolve as well. You know, and maybe those are the same, but maybe they're different. I.e., hey, when the La Nina, or I don't know, just some other factors are the controlling factors, it predicts the AOL. But when other, forcing mechanisms get more involved, certain MJO phases, maybe also combined with certain times of the year, you can start into the back half of Feb, and uh, a meteorologist I always respected used to say, long-time operational Met, when you get to the back half of Feb, things always get more complicated. This was more of a rule of thumb, but because you're starting to get into the spring things and wavelengths are changing and stuff like that. So I think that's an interesting study. I think the point is it'd be interesting to understand better as to why the AO skill was really good. It appears early in the winter, first half, whatever, and then much less good the last few weeks.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay. So let's see who. Would anyone else want to do their forecast, or we can continue talking about the teleconnections, or we could do some other third thing, But
Oh, we
anyone
also
else?
have that conversation that Dave. I mean, it's up to you. You're driving, but we had that Dave Darkangelo brought up earlier about summer trends and changes and climate influences.
Yeah, Dave, if you want to talk about that, that works too. I'm open to whatever people want to do.
Oh, what, did Dave? Maybe Dave is on mute or got booted. Oh, he's on. He's definitely on mute. Well, yeah, Michael, if you could, I mean, I could kick that off, and then we could just let people jump in if you want to spend a couple minutes on that.
Sure, why not?
Okay. And drive us in a different direction if you like. But I think what Dave was talking about just before we started the meeting was, I forgot the location. It was a location in Japan where he said a certain flower or tree was blooming like at its earliest level ever on record, and the records there go back was over 1,000 years. And so I thought, I mean, we could talk a little bit about that, but I think that was a good segue into, we are getting towards summer. And I always find it interesting thank you. I always find it interesting to see how, especially folks, including some of the folks on the line, how you deal with the fact that, we also talked about the fact that summer CDDs, at least US CDDs, have trended significantly upwards and things like that. And how do you, I guess a couple of my questions are, is there beyond, can you beat like the 10-year trend? In other words, like, is there a stronger signal at this point than just continuing to point upward, maybe a 10-year trend plus 10? And like, because we do know that there is at times going to be some of that variability. We presume it's going to happen again. Dave brought up the summer of 2009, the summer of 2014, and things like that, where we certainly did have some cooler outcomes, at least relative to the surrounding 5 and 10 years. But are those signals strong enough where you can adjust off the 10-year trend and consistently get better skill? Or frankly, is that trend and climate signal so strong at this point that by far, everything else is noise? I guess. So I don't, if I know these aren't well-formed questions, but I think you guys understand sort of the gist. I think it's just an interesting conversation. Does anyone else have any sort of thoughts as to how they're approaching the summer forecast?
Well, my quick 2 cents, I don't have a lot of experience, but my 2 cents is that using the 10-year as kind of a base state, or even the 10-year trend instead of the 10-year normal, and maybe even adding some HDDs, like you suggested, Dave, uh, is usually a pretty good base state, and sometimes is even the best forecast. Which, granted, that's not, as I understand, isn't what you want to give to clients. You don't want to just hand them the 10-year, because they can find that themselves. What do they need us for if we're just giving them the 10-year normal? Um, but overall, I agree that the 10-year is pretty hard to beat. But I think the only thing, if there is something that beats it, it might end up being like the 5-year normal would be my only guess, since it seems that each year we get warmer and warmer. Um, so that might be able to capture the warmth a little bit better if that trend continues, or um,
Hey,
but that's
Michael.
my 2 cents. Yeah.
I just want to clarify one thing, and maybe you feel like I'm being a stickler here, but the point here is clear communications and stuff. And I think something you said I would disagree with. It's fine to give them the 10-year if you feel like that is the most representative forecast. It's not a cop out. I know it feels like it, and trust me, I've been there, but it's not a cop out if you think and you can justify, right, importantly, why it's the best. Now, you may also tell them, right, they're going to want a market representation. In other words, if the rest of the market is, I don't know, they're thinking an El Nino is coming and it's going to be like 2009 again. Of course, you do want to communicate that, but you absolutely want to communicate what you think is also the best forecast, and of course, be able to defend it and say, I'm going with the 10-year because I've done all this research and I've done all these statistical things. And my analysis shows that you cannot beat the 10-year, but the market's going to do this. I'm going to do this. I think at the end of the day, my forecast is going to be right. And, let them decide how they're going to approach that, i.e., well, Michael seems to know what he's talking about. We're going to really, put a lot of weight on his forecast and hope he's right. You know what I mean? So not a cop out to just do the 10-year if you can justify why it's you think it's the most accurate forecast.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense. I just remember I thought someone at some point in the past 2 years said that it's not the best to use it all the time. I guess would be better for me to say that, not to use the 10-year every time as your forecast. Um, as the only thing in your forecast, unless it's working. But at any rate,
Yeah, just use whatever works. I mean, sir, at the end of the
yeah.
day, the trader's going to want they're going to want the market view. And Greg and others can jump in on this if I'm missing anything. Absolutely. You're going to have to provide market perspective and talk about what Maxar and CWG and the rest of the world. Absolutely. Right. They need to know what the market is thinking. So I'm separating that out. But what they also want to know, presumably, if this is part of your job, maybe it's not, but if it were, they want to know what Michael thinks is the most defensible forecast. And it may not be sexy, but if you believe that, I don't know, a 10-year rolling mean, or maybe you've done statistics like a little bit more advanced statistics, and it says that a 14-year rolling mean is the most defensible. You've got a whole bunch. That's fine. That's great. it doesn't matter where it lands. So you're right. It's a 10-year. It's a little bit arbitrary. It could be 8-year, it could be 5, could be 10, could be 15, could be where you say it doesn't really matter. It's a plus or minus kind of thing. It's in the noise. But whatever you think is most defensible.
Yeah. Here's the. I'm trying to look at the previous heating season to see what did the best, but
And I just want to say, Greg or anyone else, do you want to jump in on that? Do you have any other thoughts? I mean, I know there are different views.
No, I mean, I really do agree with what you just said for the most part. It's explicitly, if part of your job is to, come up with an actual forecast, and it's, especially within this marketplace, you need to understand the context to which everyone else is going to be trading around. So without a doubt, you need to express, hey, this is what they're saying, and this is what I'm seeing. And if you feel, like you said, justified through various ways of analogs, statistics, and all that, that you feel like you're at least standing on solid ground with your forecast, then by all means express that. And then also I would add in is where it could go wrong in the future in terms of like signposts to touch upon, to say, hey, maybe in 2 or 3 weeks we'll check back in to see if I still have solid footing or I do need to start shifting.
yeah, that makes sense. All right, so we've got a couple of minutes left here, and just something interesting. It looks like our best non-human forecaster for the last summer was actually the MJO analog with uh, with regards to 30-year. Um, pretty directionally correct. I think it's in the yeah, the only thing that was able to beat it in terms of directional correctness for non-human forecasters, of course, was persistence, the 45-day persistence. But the score for that was kind of abysmal. Um, so for what it's worth, it looks like the MJO was a pretty big player last summer, at least based off the analog. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Huh. Interesting.
Even though I,
Alternatively,
designed the original analog, I'm not an MJO expert, but I guess it kind of makes sense that, summertime, I think, right, the polar regions are less important, right? And so it's more the tropics and convection is kind of what's driving everything, more so in the summer than in the winter, although it's certainly still important in the winter. So kind of makes sense maybe that it performs especially well in the summer, but that's just my intuition more than anything.
okay, that makes sense.
What was it directionally? Can you sort directionally? Real quick?
Yeah, it was pretty good directionally as well. 85% of the time.
Dr. Roundy did a good job there too. Nat did a good job. Yeah.
Definitely curious.
Strangely enough, the next best forecast was the 15-year moving average, which to me it seems a bit odd that the 15-year moving average of all things was the next best non-human forecast.
Well,
At least
if the summer, verified closer to the 15, that could explain it. I can't remember exactly.
yeah, I don't. Was this summer on the cooler side in some parts? I don't even I don't even remember what the summer was like, to be honest. I spent most of it indoors.
Greg might know. Greg, do you remember, was it warmer or cooler than the 10-year?
Talking about last summer?
Yeah.
Hold on.
I can't remember either. Anyway, but we'll see what he says. The CFS, oh, look at the CFS directionally, it was 41%. So, again, like almost 60% of the time, if you did opposite, you would have been right.
So actually, I'll kind of, while we wait for the answer on summer. I'm going to take a look to see how the CFS has improved over the past from last year in the heating degree season. So we're at a 65% right now, which is not not great, not terrible, but it's close to the euro. It actually has fallen behind the euro in both score because of the last two verifications being so so warm compared to the coolness of the CFS. Let's see how it did last winter. Oh, this one. Oh yeah. So I mean, I think there's still a few forecasts left, but given that it's probably uh not going to, bust completely uh once we get to, I think this is the last forecast for April, if I'm not mistaken. Let me look.
It's worth noting that it looks like everyone, the general consensus is better this year than last year.
Yeah, no, for sure. We have uh with 17, I guess, being the minimum forecast requirement. Looks like most people, in fact, I think everyone got above 50 except for poor Matt Rogers. um
Well, don't worry, he's the president, so he can't be fired. He's a just kidding, Matt.
Just one comment about the CFS. Just a reminder that last summer the bias corrected CFS did pretty well, so it was getting the variations. So it'll be interesting to test this summer to see if just a simple bias correction is good enough to make CFS viable.
Yeah, that's a good point.
yeah. I mean, looking at, I guess I have to go with negative. CFS did have the biggest cold bias. I think that's a cold bias of really anything by, and excluding the 30-year by a lot. Because 7 HDD CDDs over the course of 22 forecasts, that's quite a lot. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it compares and how it ends up finishing the heating season, because right now it's kind of, it was starting out pretty strong, as we all know, and now it's just kind of it's getting tired in the eighth inning. So
I know I'm getting tired.
yeah, so I think that's a good place to stop. We're a little bit over the time, so anyone have any last minute thoughts? Maybe you're hyped for baseball season or whatever. No? All right. Well, um, I'll just say go Yankees. And thanks everyone for coming, and hope everyone has a good week.
Good job. Thank you, Michael. Thanks,
Yep.
guys.
Thanks. Yeah.